1.
Hey kids, it's good to talk with you again. Me and Jaycee are here in Abraham's tent in Promised Land. And the reason that we are recording here is that we are talking about Abraham's tent today. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were 3 generations of men who were all part of the same promise. And that promise was that Abraham would receive a land in Canaan, which was going to eventually become Israel. Now, Jaycee, what we're sitting on would be something similar to what Abraham would sit on, just a couch made of pillows and maybe some backing. And if you look up here, around here, this is kind of what they would be living in. They lived in a big tent. And a lot of times it was open, just like this room is. Of course, you wouldn't have the mountains right there necessarily, just depending on where they would stay. But back in Abraham's day, the only house you really had, for Abraham at least, was a really elaborate tent. Now, there were a lot of things in this tent that made it special. One thing, Jaycee, is that it would often be just a dirt floor, or they would have carpets put out.
Yeah.
If you can point the camera to that carpet there, it's
or maybe
on the floor.
A sand floor.
That carpet, well, depending on what was under their feet. And they would also use things like those rugs and carpets to decorate the walls and to provide a flap for the tents. And so the big part, and if you'll screen up to the ceiling, the big part was covered by a tent-like fabric. Now, this is probably not, this is canvas.
It's probably a sheet.
Well, that's canvas is what that is.
Oh.
But what it would actually be was goat hair. And I know that sounds kind of strange, but goat hair was actually a very strong material, very durable, and it would insulate, or it would keep the cold from getting in too much if it was during the winter, or it could keep the heat out during the heat of the day, because they were in the wilderness a lot. And so they may have a fire in the tent, but they might also have different spaces where they just had a campfire around outside of the tent, because the tent wasn't just one big tent. They had different rooms. And if you wanted to set up a different room in this tent, all you had to do was just take a few rugs like this, and you would basically hang them up, and you could make a separate room in the tent. And that way you'd have privacy, and one space was for the women and one space for the men. Now, you got to realize how big this is, Jaycee. Think about how big your house is, and then think about a tent that's the size of your house, because sometimes tents could be that big, depending on how rich the people were. And in fact, even today in the Middle East, they have tents that are that size. So what is a tent made of? Well, if you look with me, over here in the corner is a piece of wood. It's a strong piece of wood. And a lot of times it would be something like this, or even a strong stick that they would use to support the corners of the tent. And in the middle of the tent, I brought this just to kind of show you. In the middle of a tent, they actually had a very strong beam that would be in the center of the tent, and it would be almost twice as high as the sticks or the wooden poles that held up the 4 corners.
But this isn't that tall.
No, well, but I'm kind of showing what it would look like, and it would support the whole tent. Then they would have rope that they would use, and that rope was probably made of hemp. It's a type of plant, and they would tie the ends of the tent to the ground, just like they do today, and with a lot of tents and things like that. And that would stretch the material out to where you could raise the tent, and it wouldn't just all fall down on you, because you don't want it to fall down on you.
Because that would be bad, and you don't want to suffocate from it.
That's right. You don't want to suffocate. You don't want to wake up and the tent's on top of you. And think about the storms that they had to go through.
It would leak through the ceiling.
if you didn't have really strong material, and that's why they had the goat's hair, because it could keep rain from getting through, and it would give them, and sometimes sandstorms, and even on occasion hail and things like that, the little balls of ice.
Yeah, and snow. Maybe.
And snow.
Because snow can layer up. And
That's right. So now they didn't have a lot of snow back then, just depending on the area. But the thing about these tents is that Abraham didn't stay in one place. He basically moved every season and took all of his sheep and his goats.
And his tent.
And what he did is he got the material like this. He took it all down with his servants, and he had quite a few people with him. And one story that we told during the sermon that's coming up a little bit later this morning, Abraham had 318 fighting men from all of his servants that he had trained, or that someone had trained, and they went on, they fought a battle. So that's just the men. They also had women. They had people who were born into his household among the servants. So Abraham had a lot of people with him. Think about how many tents it would take to shelter, let's say 500 or 600 people.
That would take like maybe half the amount.
Well, it would be a lot. But they'd have a big tent like this where everybody could gather, and they would eat meals together in there. And even today, they're called Bedouin shepherds, or Bedouin travelers, Bedouin people. And they would go from place to place. So they'd pitch their tent. They'd get all of the beams that they had, or they'd have to get new ones if they had to get rid of what they had. You didn't have room for what they had. And the main thing was the big tent, and then these rugs that the women, it would take them many, many hours to make these, Jaycee. And it wasn't like they had a machine to do it. They had to do it by hand or in a loom. And they would weave fabrics together. So these were very important to them, right?
Yeah.
Because they would make great walls or doors and decorations. And there's very elaborate tents that you can find in the Middle East today. And a lot of times they would be open to where you could see all around you. But during the bad weather, they'd have extra material they could use to close it off.
And also, this setting up a tent is basically camping too. Like,
it kind of is, isn't it?
But
and of
like,
course,
they didn't have flashlights. They didn't have. Well, they did have this.
Well, they'd have fire, but they'd also have oil lamps, and that was really important because oil lamps could be used to look around at night, or to give you light to be able to see what you're doing in the evening. And so even though they didn't have electricity, those oil lamps would help them along. So we're going to read the story a little bit, and just to know why we know that Abraham was dwelling in tents. Now there's a couple of stories. One of them is when Abraham is visited by 3 strangers, and they tell Abraham that he's going to have a son. And that's when Sarah laughs, right? We talked about that already. But there's a place in Hebrews chapter 11. And if y'all have your Bibles, then you can read along. And it says in verse 8 of Hebrews 11, "By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God." Is a tent something that's permanent, Jaycee?
No.
No, it's temporary.
Temporary.
Oh, I see what you did there. Pretty good. So the tents were only meant to be temporary until they found a permanent dwelling. Now, on us right now, we have different clothes that they might have worn. Now, purple was very rare. They'd have to get different dyes for the material. But these kinds, this is more almost like royalty. And Abraham was very rich. So his wife Sarah was probably dressed in very fine clothes, okay, for the time, because he was considered a prince among the Canaanites, and he had lots of cattle, and he had lots of sheep, and he had lots of goats, and he had lots of possessions because God blessed him. So they would wear basically the same outfit every day. They didn't have a closet full of clothes.
They didn't have different selections of pants, different selections of shirts, or anything.
That's right. They had work clothes that would go under their main clothes, their outside clothes, and they had the clothes they would put on the outside. A lot of times they would sleep in these clothes too, and they'd wash them when they were dirty. You sleep in your own clothes, okay? So sometimes they would have an extra set of clothes, but it was like a big deal, right? Because it took a long time to make those clothes, but it also took material that was hard to get, especially when you're out in the wilderness, you know.
Like you would usually get material like from lamb or sheep or cows.
Yeah, wool and things like that, and so when they made something, they made it to last, and they didn't waste anything. They used everything they had. Now these stones that you see here and this wood, you know, whenever they had to cook something, they had a couple of ways to do it. They could use an oven, and they had these clay pots that were ovens, but you had to have a fire underneath them. So fire was very important. They used fire for warmth, they used fire for cooking, and they could put a spit, which is basically like a stick that goes above the fire, and they could turn that spit slowly and it could cook something. Or they did have something like a grill, and in the temple later on they would cook these animal sacrifices, and the priest could eat some of it, and the rest of it would be sacrificed, right?
Why would the... Never mind.
Well, they had to eat meat, so
yeah.
It served a purpose. It was a sacrifice to God, but some of it was given to the priest because they didn't have as much land as everybody else. They served in the temple.
And also, one of the only things that are different about this tent too is that the verse is in the sky, but it wasn't in the sky.
Yeah, the verse is in the sky, but you know, this is decorated to be Abraham's tent. But if you think about it, the only difference that you would probably see is there would be decorations like this here and there along the walls.
There wouldn't be a TV.
There would be a TV. Well, we're obviously, you know, you're not have anything modern, but then they would also have the rope that would be attached a little bit further out from the tent that would hold up the top of the tent. Now, we did a challenge, Jaycee, several weeks ago. We did the tent challenge in church, and we actually built a tent in our living room. And you guys, you can do that if you want. All you need is a central support.
A tarp, maybe.
Well, yeah. You need a central support and 4 other supports, and you can use chairs or whatever. But you need something that will raise it up enough to where you can stand or lean down in it, and then you need ropes to tie off. Now, what we did is we tied them off to the wall because we didn't need supports. We connected it to the walls of our house. We already had, somewhere to put it. But if you're just doing it in the backyard or whatever, then you just need a big material. We have a tarp, a really large tarp that you can use, and it has little holes on the end, and you can tie string to it. But then you need the supports, so central support and at least 4 supports on the end, and some structures had more than 4 supports. They had a lot of supports. So anyways, they would also need pillows and something soft. They would use this to recline on. They would also sleep on these, okay? And they would fill them up a lot of times with wool or something really soft, so it was a good place to take a nap in. They would also carry utensils and things like that with them, and drinking vessels, pots and bowls and things to be able to cook in. The women would make bread every day. The men would, if they needed to, they could kill a sheep or lamb, and sometimes they had vegetables. But a lot of times, if they had things like vegetables and other things, they had to trade. They had to buy from somebody who planted, who had gardens or vineyards or whatever. So the Bedouin people, they mainly had sheep, and they could sell their wool to people, or they could sell sheep to people and trade. And Abraham was very good at it, and God blessed him very much, and he had lots and lots of sheep and lots and lots of animals, and that made him rich. So, if you were to get married, Jaycee, if I was to find somebody to marry you back in that day, then oftentimes I would give them a dowry. Basically, I might give them my best cow for you to get married, right? Isn't that kind of weird?
Yeah, like you trade okay, you marry my daughter, and I'll give you so-and-so.
Yeah, I'll give you a really good cow or a bull or I'll give you some jewelry or something or some money.
I'll give you sheep, wool.
And then in return, he would give the father what's called the bride price, which was money to compensate losing a daughter, because even though they might see each other some, he would lose somebody who could help him to do all the things that they needed to do in the family. Usually, everybody stayed with their family back then. You didn't just go off and do your own thing.
Yeah.
It was very rare for the family to separate. And Abraham and Lot, his nephew, they separated and they went their different ways because Lot had so many sheep and goats and that needed land to eat grass and other things on that they had to separate.
Yeah.
So that happens sometimes. But anyways, it would be really interesting to live in a tent. It's not like now where we live in a house. And whenever the seasons changed or they needed to go somewhere where there was more grass for the cows to eat or to eat, have a pasture where they could eat, then they would just pull everything up and they would roll everything up just like this. You want to help me roll this up, Jaycee?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, just hold it for me. Whoa.
Yeah, you should hold it.
Yeah. All right. Now, can you pick it up?
Oh.
And a servant or someone would put it on a cart, and yep, you would just go to the next place.
Yeah, but I don't want to go to the next place.
Yeah, you don't want to go to there's not really anywhere for you to go right now.
Yeah.
So anyways, they would do that for the whole tent. They would take these pieces of wood down, and they might have a cart where they would carry these, or they would just have people carry these. They would take all of their pillows and store them. And it might have been every couple of months, but they always were moving around. And the Bible says that they waited for a city without foundations whose builder and maker is God. In other words, they waited for something better than a permanent place to live. Thank you. And a lot of times if you didn't want to sit on the ground, you would sit on something like this, a nice rug. And that way you wouldn't get your bottom wet. Or a rock, yeah. And sometimes they would even carry things like that so that they would have something to sit on or something to use for furniture. So that's what Abraham's tent is all about. If y'all ever wondered, Abraham actually lived in a tent, and it was a very nice tent, but it had to be moved every so often. Abraham did that, and he lived in a land that was foreign to him because he wanted to be faithful to God and because God promised him a land flowing with milk and honey, a land that was full of abundance where he could finally not have to be in a tent anymore. And I bet when the children of Israel finally got to Canaan and got to live there, they were glad they were done living in tents. I know I would be too. All right, Jaycee, that's all the time we have, so tell the kids goodbye.
Bye.